if you ask me, is our relationship normal today? My answer to you is no, it is not. And it cannot be normal if the situation in the border areas is abnormal.
此次事件完全是由于印方违背共识、单方面挑衅造成的。
India's arch foe has become Pakistan. And of course, China is now investing heavily in Pakistan. China is also investing in Afghanistan. So I believe that India doesn't like it.
Credit should go to China Merchant Ports for having come to Sri Lanka and invested here to build this terminal.
我们反对搞胁迫外交，反对为了自身目的损害你主权和利益。
I don't really believe it's in China's interest to actually be initiating and engaging in a hot war anywhere, whether it's with India, whether it's with Taiwan or anything else. But I could still be wrong. I mean, I don't think very many people expected the beginning of the year that we'd be seeing war in Europe initiated by President Putin. So who knows?
As the pandemic was raging in 2020, Indian and Chinese troops faced off in the Galwan Valley. Indian officials say the standoff began in early May when large contingents of Chinese soldiers entered deep inside Indian-controlled territory. They say the soldiers ignored repeated verbal warnings, triggering a yelling match, stone throwing, and even fistfights. The situation turned deadly at night when the rival troops engaged in a clash resembling medieval battles. According to Indian officials, Chinese troops threw stones, punched and pushed Indian soldiers down a ridge at around 4,500 meters. The Chinese account of things is different.
5月6日凌晨，印度边防部队越线进入中国领土，构攻设障，阻拦中国边防部队正常巡逻。6月15日晚，印度一线边防部队出尔反尔，再次越过实控线，向中方蓄意挑衅。中方官兵在现地交涉时，突然受到印方暴力攻击。此次事件完全是由于印方违背共识、单方面挑衅造成的。
China claims about 90,000 square kilometers of territory in India's northeast, while India says China occupies 38,000 square kilometers of its territory in the Aksai Chin Plateau in the Himalayas.
The Security Council.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor is the former Undersecretary of the United Nations. In 2006, he ran for the top position at the UN and was second to Ban Ki-moon. Afterwards, he joined the Indian government and headed a parliamentary committee that looked at the issue.
The thing which is different from the past is that both sides, recognizing that the border was undemarcated in the sense that neither side agreed with the other side's perception of the border, had worked out a very good situation in which each side would patrol one day up to what it considered its line. They would patrol, and then the other side would patrol up to what it considered its line the following day, and they avoided getting in each other's way, and both were able to maintain their claims. Suddenly, the Chinese side crossed over into what India considers its territory, essentially violating this unwritten understanding of decades, and proceeded to install itself in areas where, prior to the late April of 2020, Indian troops had routinely been patrolling. So suddenly there's a denial of access to some territory, which is a new development. And India considers that an inadmissible change in the status quo and wants the status quo of April 2020 restored. That is the problem we have.
In June, thousands gathered for the funeral procession of Indian Colonel Santosh Babu in his hometown of Hyderabad. He was among those killed during the deadly clash near the border. This was one of several protests against China that took place across India as a result of the border clash.
China took the first step by indulging in military action that resulted in the deaths of 20 of our service personnel, which in a democracy is never something you can just brush aside. The bodies are being returned to 20 villages around the country, and the tensions were very high and passions were inflamed.
In July, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a trip to a military base near the border.
विस्तारवाद का युग समाप्त हो चुका है। ये युग विकासवाद का है। तेजी से बदलते हुए समय में विकासवाद ही प्रासंगिक है। विस्तारवाद की जीत जब किसी पर सवार हुई है, उसने हमेशा विश्व शांति के सामने खतरा पैदा किया है। और साथियों, ये न भूले, इतिहास गवाह है कि ऐसी ताकतें मिट गई हैं या मुड़ने के लिए मजबूर हो गई हैं। भारत माता की वंदे वंदे।
Since then, India has sent large reinforcements of soldiers, military equipment, and fighter jets into the already highly militarized area. Indian media reports that there are currently 60,000 Chinese troops at the border, with a similar number on the Indian side. India has also stepped up its participation in the Quad, which is a group of 4 countries, including the US, Australia, and Japan.
There is a Cold War that is created between India and China. India is now a part of the Western Alliance. And we are seeing that India is the principal bulwark against China. India is a big country, a very powerful country, not as powerful as China, but certainly the US strategy is to counter Chinese power and Chinese influence. And India is at the forefront of it.
Conflict between these two great nations dates back half a century to the 1962 war.
Red China poured troops over her northern frontier, and India's people mobilized to meet the threat. India had been ill-prepared to defend herself. The people donated their jewelry and life savings to the defense effort.
Hostilities lasted only a month. But that chapter in history continues to color current affairs. China continues to claim the Indian-controlled Arunachal Pradesh, while New Delhi lays claim to the Chinese-controlled Aksai Chin territory. And the 3,000-kilometer-long border between China and India remains one of the most militarized stretches of territory in the world. Despite the border dispute, India-China ties have actually been largely positive up until the recent border clashes. Trade between the two grew from around $3 billion in the year 2000 to $125 billion in the year 2021. You can see evidence of that everywhere. In India today, there are hundreds of tiny shops that import goods from China, then sell them to local retailers all across the country.
There's a lot of advantages doing business with China. First would be the cost. They're really cost effective. And second would be the variety what we get over there. Third would be the production. I mean, you name it. If you want, for example, if you want 10,000 pieces of one item, you can get in, I would say, 10 days. Things are really easy now. It's not that hard. And they're getting easy day by day because they are starting to speak good English. So it's really easy to communicate. Nature-wise, they are good people.
But political relations have not been as cozy of late. Troubles began as early as 2013 when China expanded its Belt and Road Initiative. Massive construction projects in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Maldives caused unease in Delhi.
So India's arch foe has become Pakistan. And of course, China is now investing heavily in Pakistan. China is also investing in Afghanistan. So I believe that India doesn't like it.
The border clashes strain ties further.
对于历史遗留下来的边界问题，中方始终主张要通过平等协商来管控分歧，积极寻求公正合理的解决办法。同时，我们始终认为不能够让边界领土这些历史遗留问题来影响和干扰我们现实的关系，特别是两国合作的大局。
As the Ukraine crisis prompted security discussions in India, Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a surprise trip to Delhi, the first time in 2 years. There were no flowery welcomes.
The situation there is not normal. If peace and tranquility is the foundation of the basis of how we are going forward, then obviously that is also disturbed. So the answer in that sense is, if you ask me, is our relationship normal today? My answer to you is no, it is not. And it cannot be normal if the situation in the border areas is abnormal. And surely the presence of a large number of troops there in contravention of agreements is abnormality.
Indeed, there are territorial disputes between China and India along the Himalayas. But do you know who created these territorial disputes? It's not by the Chinese people. It's not by the Indian people. It was created by the British colonial rulers of India. These were bombs left over by the British colonists in India. So I think neither China nor India should become victims of these colonial legacies left over by the British when they were the overlords of India.
My view is that that would be a very valid interpretation if both countries were able to come to agreement. In fact, the truth is that for some reason, China has decided that it wants to keep India constantly hopping on the defensive by making territorial claims and small local territorial advances. While the talks have gone on, there have been 18 or 19 rounds of talks between special representatives going back to 1992. Not even an inch of progress has been made. So if you have a willingness to see this as a colonial legacy, then don't carry on the colonial attitudes into the negotiating table. Sit down together and try and solve it. But it seems to us that the Chinese, by constantly saying that we can leave this dispute for future generations to settle, which is a favorite Chinese line, are essentially saying that we're already 5 times the size of your economy, our military is 2 or 3 times your size and strength. If we wait for another generation, we'll be so much larger, more powerful and richer than you that you will cave. I mean, if that's their intention, I think with a country like India, they will have to have another think coming.
When it comes to China's Belt and Road Initiative, Pakistan stands out as the largest country for its projects so far, with investments from China totaling over 27 billion and counting. Starting from special economic zones in the south near Gwadar, it aims to industrialize large swaths of Pakistan, building logistical channels northwards to the Chinese city of Kashgar in Xinjiang. In return, the Chinese are planning to reduce their dependency on the South China Sea for much of their trade from the Middle East, cutting the travel time by about 15 days, or about 3,000 kilometers. And the backbone of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is this road, the Karakoram Highway. 4,700 meters above sea level, its construction was treacherous considering the terrain. Construction of some parts of the road actually began all the way back in 1959. Nearly 900 Pakistani and Chinese workers died building this strategic road. Many of them were buried here at the Chinese cemetery in Gilgit.
1966 से लेकर 78 तक जितने बंदे मतलब 110 बंदे मरे थे उनमें से 88 बंदे यहाँ पे मिले बाकी के 22 बंदे कोई दरिया में गया है कोई पत्थर के नीचे आया है ये चाइना से आया है सर चाइना के लिए हमारे लिए चाइना हमारे लिए बहुत अहम है सर उन लोगों ने हमें मतलब अच्छे खासे रोड बना के दिए जहाँ हम 24 घंटे में जा रहे थे अभी वहाँ पे 18-20 घंटे में बंदा पहुँचा हम मतलब बहुत मशहूर है चाइना के.
Pakistanis today remember their sacrifices. With the Karakoram Highway, China and Pakistan remain connected all year round for trade, despite heavy snowfalls. Due to this all-weather friendship, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has given hope to people like Majid.
सर ये सी पैक के हवाले से तो बहुत ही अच्छा हो रहा है अभी मतलब यहाँ से ट्रेन की बतरी बीच आएगी मतलब उधर से सी पैक बंद हुआ मतलब आएगा तो मतलब काफ़ी लोगों के लिए मतलब रोजगारियाँ मतलब खुली रहेगी यहाँ पे.
Not far from Gilgit is the Sos Dry Port, the entry point into Pakistan from China. Just 100 kilometers from the Chinese border, this trading port is bustling with activity.
I'm one of the importers who go to China or send their people to China. They go to different cities, to Guangzhou, to Urumqi. They buy the consumer goods from there according to the volume of their own investment. Chinese containers basically bring it here. They offload all the goods here. People from the custom, of course, examine it. They calculate the duties, and then we clear our goods from here, from this port. We load them back in Pakistani trucks, and we head back to our destinations.
Because of the Karakoram Highway development, goods from China that earlier took weeks can now reach Islamabad in less than a day. During the pandemic, Pakistan and China trade continued to set new records, with Pakistan's exports to China growing 34% in the last year. China is the second largest export destination for Pakistan, due in part to transport corridors built here as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. There are also plans to develop this highway into an economic corridor by laying optic fiber cable along its entire length, rail links, and oil and gas pipelines. But neighboring India offers a different perspective on the Karakoram Highway.
The famous road that connects China to the Pakistani port of Gwadar runs through territory that even China until then had acknowledged to be disputed territory, which is, in other words, the Pakistani occupied portion of Jammu and Kashmir state. Jammu and Kashmir had acceded to India in 1947. This was disputed, there was a standoff, and essentially India ended up with about 2/3 of the state and Pakistan 1/3. And where the Chinese have built a road is right through the portion of Jammu and Kashmir, which India considers to be its own territory. So whereas China took the stand that each country is claiming it and therefore it's a dispute, you do not normally, as a foreign country, interfere in a dispute by building a road through territory you yourself admit is disputed.
On the 6th of February 2022, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan in Beijing on the sidelines of the Winter Olympics, with the leaders calling the trip a sign of the Iron Brotherhood between the two countries. In a statement released, President Xi said that the strategic significance of China-Pakistan relations is getting more prominent since the world has entered a period of turbulence and transformation.
Pakistan relationship is a crucial relationship for Pakistan, and also increasingly it is a crucial relationship for China. because of China's confrontation with India.
And there are other concerns, obviously, including intellectual ones, about the debt trap that countries participating in BRI have been falling into. Colombo, for example, Sri Lanka, is so much in debt to the Chinese that essentially one of their major ports, Hambantota, has been handed over to China on a 99-year lease because they couldn't afford to service the debt. And we're afraid something similar will happen to Pakistan, and that Pakistan will essentially become even more of what it already is, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese state.
India has an absolute sovereign right not to join the Belt and Road Initiative because this is a unilateral initiative by China. And given their difficult relationship with China, it's understandable why they do not want to join the Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, I think India made a strategic mistake in not joining the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, because India has, for the last 20 or 30 years, said that India is going to look east. And by the way, East Asia is going to become the most prosperous and dynamic economic region in the world by far by 2050. The best way to integrate with East Asia is to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And friends of India within RCEP, like Australia, like Japan, like Singapore, delayed the conclusion of the RCEP to allow India to join RCEP. So I would argue that it is in India's long-term strategic interest to join the RCEP.
Well, actually, I'm an advocate of India joining RCEP, which I must say many people in my party are not, and the ruling party clearly are not. As I understand it, their fears are essentially of Indian businesses and industries being swamped by China. And RCEP, without China, India would have joined.
RCEP is an example of how ties between the two Asian giants affect all countries in the region. And sometimes, when titans clash, it can have dangerous consequences on smaller countries. This is Colombo International Container Terminals. It's managed by a joint venture company between China Merchants Holdings and the Sri Lanka Ports Authority. The terminal boasts cutting-edge equipment to swiftly unload the hundreds of containers on board.
The cranes that you see here right now, they are the largest cranes with a 70-meter outreach. The technology for these cranes come from our parent company, which is China Merchant Ports. They run the biggest ports in China, as you know. So within the first year of establishing this terminal, China brought all that technology and passed on to us. Credit should go to China Merchant Ports for having come and invested in this terminal. This ship like this is doing about 3,600 moves, and we hope to turn it around within 12 hours, all going well. That's how it works. Our productivity levels are on par above the international standards. We are on par with the other likes of the other big transshipment hubs like Singapore, Philippines, or Salalah.
China's involvement in managing the port here has been a critical point in the port's success.
If you look at the world, you see places like Aden, for instance. In terms of location, they are more strategic than Colombo, but they have not come up to the level that Port of Colombo achieved during the last 3 decades, because they were unable to cater to the demand in time. But Port of Colombo managed to provide facilities just in time. Whenever the shipping lines expanded their operations and introduced larger and larger ships demanding for greater depth and so on, Colombo was able to immediately get in there and provide the facilities.
Colombo Port was ranked world's 22nd after a 6% growth in 2021.
It's a great achievement for a small country like Sri Lanka, and a port that was non-existent in the world map, something like 40 years ago.
This port here is just one component of a much larger plan by China and Sri Lanka. The plan is to build Colombo Port City, a high-tech city which will host an offshore international financial center, residential areas, and a marina. Think Dubai, Monaco, or Hong Kong. Large-scale land reclamation is underway. The cost? $1.4 billion. The investor is China Harbor Engineering Company, who has been given 43% of it on a 99-year lease. Officials estimate it will take about 25 years to complete the project, the first of its kind in South Asia. The Port City project was officially unveiled during Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Colombo all the way back in 2014, a year after he launched his Belt and Road Initiative.
We have in Sri Lanka very significant investments by the Chinese. And of course, the Western countries call it the debt trap. But I want to tell you that Sri Lanka ended a 30-year war. And Sri Lanka needs to build its relationship with all countries to develop itself, because for 30 years it suffered. So Sri Lanka's foreign policy posture since the current government came to office in 2019 is called neutrality, foreign policy of neutrality, where it can deal with the Americans, with the Europeans, with India, with China.
But I think that any visitor to Sri Lanka will look around and say it doesn't look very neutral. When you look at major investments, it seems that China is the main investment partner.
You're correct. But I want to share with you that since the current government came to power, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, since 2019, the pendulum has moved from China, from a Chinese-centric towards India, and it's moving towards the West to balance the relations. The most recent investment Sri Lanka received was from India. So I think that Sri Lankan leaders today understand that we must maintain neutrality.
It is very unfortunate India is one of the big countries which has not participated in real earnest in the Belt and Road Initiative. As a matter of fact, India lacks greater connectivity on its land with its neighboring countries and with island countries in the Indian Ocean. For example, people talk a lot about that port in Sri Lanka that China helps to build up and strengthen. That port is not only a very important port for the purposes of the Sri Lankan people, it also serves as a very important transportation hub for Indian ports. Why? Because that Sri Lankan port is more efficient, and many Indian ports are less efficient. So in a sense, I think, beefing up connectivity, improving productivity and efficiency will work for India's own benefit.
But China's infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka have not been without controversy. In March, Sri Lankans poured into the streets. For weeks, they had been facing severe economic hardship. Not enough fuel, not enough cooking gas, not enough food.
මම මේ රජයට කිසිම බරක් නැහැ. බරක් තියෙන මට හොඳට මිල මුදල් තියෙනවා. මගේ හැබැයි මිල මුදල් වලින් කිසිම වැඩක් නැහැ. මොකද මට තියෙන කොච්චර purchasing power එක. ඒ කියන්නේ මට සල්ලි තිබුණත් බඩු ගන්න බෑ. මට පෙට්‍රල් ගහ ගන්න බෑ. මට ඒ වගේ මේ උදාහරණ කීපයක් කියන්නේ. මට ගිහිල්ලා ගෑස් සිලින්ඩර් කීවරයි ගෑස් එකක් ගන්න විදියක් නැහැ.
The crisis is a result of a struggling economy caused by the pandemic. With poor revenue, the government is struggling to pay back foreign loans. The government only has an estimated $2 billion in its reserves, but it needs to pay back about $7 billion this year to its foreign lenders. So it simply did not have the foreign exchange to pay for the imports of fuel, food, and medicines that people need. Debt had literally plunged the country into darkness.
Sri Lanka is right now experiencing lengthy power cuts. This is due to two reasons. One is being the natural cause that we are depleting our reservoir water levels. Therefore, we need to curtail the generation of hydropower. The other one is due to non-availability of forex or exchange, and we cannot import the necessary fuel.
Security concerns for India also loom on the horizon. It's been a topic of hot debate amongst experts whether China's Belt and Road Initiative could in fact be an elaborate cloak for Beijing's military ambitions. The final aim would be to provide the Chinese Navy with access to a series of ports stretching from the South China Sea to Africa's east coast. This view has been known as the String of Pearls theory. According to this view, the pearls include Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and the Seychelles. In Myanmar, as part of the Belt and Road Plan, China has already built the terminus of a $1.5 billion oil pipeline and a parallel natural gas pipeline running to Kunming, capital of southwestern China's Yunnan province. Large oil tankers are already docking here and offloading their oil cargo to China. Plans for the China-funded Chaopu Deepwater Port and Special Economic Zone was on hold under the previous Aung San Suu Kyi government. In August 2021, the junta invited bids to provide legal services for these projects. Myanmar media reported that the junta and China are pushing ahead with the Chaopu Deepwater Port and Special Economic Zone. Over in Bangladesh, China has also been among the top investors here. In 2019, Bangladesh gave China access to two of its largest seaports, Chittagong and Mongla. It also gave India access. But more recently, China signed a deal to develop the Mongla port. In Pakistan, the port city of Gwadar is built with Chinese assistance and financial aid. Seychelles is a country famed for its tranquil beaches and blue waters. India and Seychelles signed an agreement to build a military base in 2015, but it remains unratified by the Seychelles National Assembly. This follows news in 2011 that China is considering using Seychelles ports for Chinese naval ships.
The string of pearls theory is a very simple one. That is, the Indians believe that China is working with its neighboring countries to surround India and to threaten India. So we have seen very significant Chinese investments in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, and in Pakistan. So naturally, India feels threatened. And I think it is good time for all these countries to understand that you are still in India's neighborhood.
The string of pearls theory has been discussed for more than a decade, and the Ukraine crisis has renewed interest in the subject.
The string of pearls theory, very simply, is that China is trying to encircle India with a number of naval bases in surrounding countries in such a way that it's like a string of pearls around your neck, which the Chinese can then tighten to choke you, and choke your neck. Now, my answer to that has always been, even if they're trying to do it, which is debatable, I would say that India has a fairly robust neck, and that is not so easily strangled. But at the same time, we do believe that India should take seriously the attempts by China to constrain us by a significant presence around us.
China has no military presence in Sri Lanka. Our relationship with China is economic relationship. Sri Lanka will never compromise Indian security. This I can give this guarantee to you as the current Director General of the Institute of National Security Studies in Sri Lanka.
Pakistan, even very good relations with China, but it's still a sovereign state. So the Gwadar port or Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, what can we use? It depends on their country, their government. China invests a lot. But the Belt and Road Initiative is economic, basically.
China hasn't fought a war across its borders since 1979. China has not been involved in a military skirmish involving guns and bullets since 1989 when it had a skirmish with the Vietnamese in South China Sea. But of course, China had an unfortunate clash with Indian soldiers where sadly lots of Indian and Chinese soldiers died through face-to-face fighting with fists and wooden clubs. But overall, if you look at China's record, China has been very careful about not getting involved in military activities. And I think we want to keep it that way because China is clearly becoming a much stronger military power, which is a natural development. When China goes from having an economy that is 10% of the United States in purchasing power parity terms in 1980 towards having an economy that in PPP terms is bigger than the United States, it's quite natural for its defense budget to become the second largest in the world. So the question for us is how do we ensure that we have a rather remarkably fortunate situation that the guns have been silent in East Asia for over 40 years now. And there have been no major wars. Let's keep it that way. But that requires a very strong, powerful, aggressive diplomacy to keep it that way. And that, I think, is what's missing in our region. We don't have enough of that.
अमेरिकी साम्राज्यवाद मुर्दाबाद दलालहरू होशियार
2nd of March 2022, thousands gather in Kathmandu to protest against the US government's Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC Pact. The MCC is a US government aid agency, and it agreed in 2017 to provide a $500 million grant to fund electricity transmission lines and road improvement projects here. But its approval by Parliament in March this year triggered street protests. Opposition comes predominantly from Nepal's communist parties who have long sought closer ties with China.
In the last 40 years, China has supported and sponsored certain interests in Nepal, and India has done the same. So Nepal has become a geopolitical hotbed. So the Chinese assistance is given to certain organizations, parties and trade unions and activists, and they are having a quit India campaign. They are saying that we don't want India. And those who are funded and supported by India are saying we don't want China. So it's become a geopolitical hotbed. So geopolitics and foreign interference is a major, major challenge for small countries. And small states must manage their geopolitical relations intelligently.
Thousands of stone-throwing protesters, prominently from the youth wings of communist parties, have clashed with riot police over the MCC. A vivid example of how when titans clash, smaller states get drawn in.
中方欢迎国际社会同尼泊尔开展发展合作，为尼经济增长和民生改善贡献力量，但这应当充分尊重尼人民的意愿，不应附加任何政治条件。我们反对搞胁迫外交，反对为了自身目的损害尼主权和利益。
I think that the Nepalese, as a country, are very, very important to both of us, and particularly to India, because we have an open border with Nepal. Nepalese are the only people who can come to India without a passport, who are allowed to work in India. It's sort of like the Canada and the US, if you like. It's a very intimate relationship. So when things go particularly wrong in Nepal, India has a special set of concerns, which inevitably give India an influential role in trying to broker a peace.
Protests in Nepal, border tensions between India and China, economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Are these signs of the times that we now live in?
The world is being split, where India is working with the US, with Europe, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, New Zealand. And Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, they are working. So that's why a new Cold War is emerging.
The politicians, they want to attract the attention, always use the new Cold War or decouple or the end of the history or whatever. China, Russia, Iran, yes, close relations. But it's for maybe energy, geography or strategic thinking. But they are not too much economic independent. Cannot compare of the relations between China and the US or Japan or the European Union. It's a different level.
Perhaps the lines of the New World Order are not so clear. It wasn't so long ago that Indian Prime Minister Modi met with Russian President Putin to discuss defense and trade relations. India abstained on the United Nations resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia is a major supplier of arms to India. But India has also recently drawn closer to the US. It is one of the members of Quad, along with Japan, Australia, and America.
The Quad is really barking at the wrong tree and is starting at the wrong track. Why? Because we know, and if we do not know, we need to remind ourselves that India's tradition is non-alliance. India has been a champion in the world for the non-alliance movement for all these decades. Non-alliance and independence of decision-making runs deep in the Indian gene and in the Indian blood. This is what makes India as it is today. This is a great heritage. Now, if the United States believe that they can really hook India onto the Asian-Pacific version of NATO and bind India onto the bandwagon against China, they will be futile in this debate, in this pursuit. And this is revealed in a very eloquent way during the war in Ukraine, because, surprisingly, India is not caving into pressure from Washington or to the United Kingdom in joining in the sanctions against Russia. India is doing exactly what China is doing. We do not condemn Russia. We do not impose sanctions against Russia. We want to be more objective. We want to see the merits of each of these complicated strands in the situation involving Ukraine. And in this way, Washington is almost losing patience with India of saying, how can the largest democracy in the world follow the leadership of the United States in imposing sanctions against Russia? India is very eagerly importing crude oil from Russia at a huge discount, and I hope India will continue to do that. For what? For the benefit of the Indian people.
I have been an advocate of a constrainment or constraining policy on our part, along with other partners, for Chinese adventurism. I think, to my mind, the Quad, for example, which ties India with Australia, Japan, and the US, is an excellent instrument to constrain China getting far too big for its boots. I think it's important for us to realize that what China is trying to do alone to us, we don't have the capacity to do to them, but together with others, we can. And in some ways, this kind of mutual deterrence, this attempts to constrain each other, might actually give us the peaceful atmosphere that will enable other things to develop.
May calm prevail in two of Asia's oldest civilizations.
At the end of the day, this is the most important point, you see. The Indian policy makers have not understood why China has become so powerful as an economy. Now, in 1980, the Indian economy and Chinese economy were about the same size. Today, China's economy has become 5 times bigger than India. What happened? What's the magic? How did China's economy become 5 times larger? And the answer was given by Xi Jinping when he spoke in Davos in January 2017. And I was there. He said, China plunged into the ocean of globalization. China struggled to swim. China drank water. But then China became a stronger swimmer. And therefore, I believe the Indian economy can become as large as the Chinese economy, if not bigger than the Chinese economy. But India has got to plunge into the ocean of globalization. India has got to struggle to swim. India has got to drink water while it's swimming in the ocean of globalization. And then India will emerge as a stronger swimmer.